So the study design requires you to know the stance of basically the last 4 years' budgets and basically how budgetary policy has been used in the policy mix in the last 4 years to try and achieve certain goals. So going back to 2012, 2013, which is essentially really 5 budgets ago now, but basically this was meant to be a really contractionary budget. They wanted to reduce the deficit from $43.4 billion and they aimed to achieve a surplus of $1.5 billion. Unfortunately, because of things like natural disasters and lower consumer confidence, the budget did end up getting pushed into deficit, which made them hard to achieve their goal, and they ended up having a deficit of $18.8 billion. What they did, though, is the deficit should have been higher than $18.8 billion, but what they did is they transferred some of their expenditure from this period into the next period to try and inflate their budget figures in 2012, 2013. So in 2013, 2014, the underlying deficit was inflated, and therefore the deficit ended up being $48.5 billion. It also expanded out because there was a slowdown in growth during that period. Commodity prices started to fall as well, which led to a bigger budget deficit than anticipated. But some of it was because they basically were paying for stuff from the period before. So $48.5 billion in 2013, 2014. Then 2014, 2015 was the big contractionary budget, was meant to be contractionary, which is with when Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott basically decided to have a really contractionary stance with their budget. So it was referred to as a mildly contractionary budget, which was probably putting it a little bit loosely. But their aim was to decide to try and restrain expenditure and promote fiscal consolidation. So it was the first real push towards fiscal consolidation. Most of the improvement in the income in the budget outcome was meant to be due to cyclical rather than structural factors. So they were trying to reduce the deficit, but they thought they'd be able to reduce it more because the economy was growing faster. Unfortunately, what happened though is the terms of trade fell during this period and the deficit grew out more than we actually thought it would be. So the increase in the deficit from what they estimated was mainly because of cyclical factors. It was also basic, even though there was a lot of deliberate contractionary policies within this year's budget, most of them weren't to take effect until the next year. So they didn't end up having, they didn't affect the budget outcome from 2014, 2015 too greatly. And most of these contractionary policies, like the GP co-payment and stuff like that, didn't actually ever get through Parliament. The last 2 years is where we really need to focus. This year's budget and last year's budget. So 2015-2016 budget, it was initially meant to be mildly contractionary because the deficit for 2014-2015 ended up being $37.9 billion, and they tried to reduce that to $35.1 billion. However, unfortunately, the deficit blew out a little bit more than what they expected it to be. So many cyclical factors, including slow wage growth, unemployment grew to 6.2%. They collected less company tax because of falling commodity prices again, basically pushed the deficit out further than what they thought it would be, and actually made the actual budget deficit higher than what it was the year before. So essentially, the budget deficit, this was a more expansionary budget. The structural measures were more expansionary than the year before, but the main reason for the increase in the deficit was because the economy started to grow slowly. So slow wage growth, high unemployment, lower company taxes because of lower commodity prices. This year's budget, which we've talked about a little bit already, estimated deficit of $37.1 billion. That is down from $39 billion, which was estimated for last year. So it is a mildly contractionary budget. The smaller deficit implies a slightly contractionary stance. However, there are lots of discretionary expansionary policies within this year's budget. So basically, the government essentially acknowledged as part of this year's budget that it's going to take a while to get back to surplus, and essentially we're not in any rush. So the government is still transitioning away from the fact that we had a mining boom where we had high commodity prices and high company taxes, and is accepting that it's going to take quite a long time before we get back to surplus. So they don't want to put any really harsh measures that are going to slow the economy down. Therefore, they're focusing more on basically getting us back and helping us to thrive after the mining boom. Having said that, part of the reason that the deficit has fallen from last year is mainly because real GDP is growing faster than last year. So real GDP is at 3.1%. Last year it was at 2.5%. So the growth rate has increased a fair bit over the last year. Unemployment's also lower than last year. So unemployment's at 5.7%, where last year it was at 6%. So again, it's helping to increase the amount of tax the government's collecting. So to sum up, the 2016-2017 budget, mildly contractionary as the budget deficit has fallen, but there are many discretionary policies that will boost consumption spending and increase private investment spending within the economy. As you'll hear from Malcolm Turnbull, Matthias Cormann, it is a budget for jobs and growth, or jobs and growth to be. No, that didn't work. I won't talk about this. I'll talk about this a little bit more in class. It's basically saying the same thing. Thank you.